Welcome to True Crime Stories for English Learners, where real-life mysteries meet clear and simple English.
H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. The Devil's City. Chicago, 1893. The city is alive with noise, color, and the smell of ambition. Millions of people from all over the world are coming to see one of the most spectacular events in American history, the World's Columbian Exposition, also called the World's Fair. There are great white buildings made to look like ancient temples. There are electric lights, which most people have never seen before. There is music, food, laughter, and wonder. But not everyone who walks into Chicago walks back out. In a building just a few streets away from the bright lights of the fair, a man is watching. He stands near the window of his hotel, looking at the crowds below. Young women, mostly. They have come to Chicago alone, looking for jobs, for adventure, for a new life. They carry small bags and wear their best dresses. They are hopeful. The man smiles. He is tall, handsome, and well-dressed. He has deep blue eyes and a dark beard that he keeps carefully cut. When he speaks, his voice is soft and calm. He seems kind. He seems trustworthy. He is neither of those things. His name, or at least one of his names, is Henry Howard Holmes, and what he has built just down the road with his own hands and his own mind is something that will shock the world when it is finally discovered. Something so dark, so carefully planned that people will struggle to believe a human being could have created it. They will start to call him the Devil of Chicago. But the story of how he became that man begins long before the World's Fair. It begins in a small town in New Hampshire with a boy who was always a little different. A man with many names. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. It was a quiet, religious town. His family was strict and cold. His father, Levi Mudgett, was a man who believed in hard discipline. Young Herman grew up feeling isolated from other children. He was clever, much cleverer than the people around him, and he knew it. Other children sensed something wrong with him. There were stories that older boys in his school took him to a local doctor's office to frighten him with a human skeleton kept there. But instead of running away in fear, young Herman became fascinated. He returned alone later. He studied the bones. He was not afraid. He was curious. As he grew older, that curiosity became something more troubling. There were rumors about animals found dead in strange conditions near the Mudgett farm. Nothing was ever proven, but the rumors followed Herman like a shadow. He was intelligent enough to gain entrance to the University of Michigan Medical School, which was remarkable for someone from a poor background at that time. He studied medicine, and he was good at it. But medical school also gave him something else: access to human bodies, access to a world where death was treated as something ordinary, something to be examined and understood. He graduated in 1884. By that time, there were already questions about money that had gone missing and insurance policies that had been claimed in suspicious circumstances. Herman Mudgett was beginning to develop a particular skill, the ability to charm people, to make them trust him completely, and then to use that trust against them. He moved from place to place, leaving problems behind him at each location. He used different names. Sometimes he was Henry Howard Holmes. Sometimes he was other people entirely. He married women, sometimes while he was already married to someone else, and then disappeared, leaving behind broken promises and sometimes worse.
By the time he arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s, he had left a trail of fraud, deception, and unanswered questions stretching across several American states. But in Chicago, everything was about to become much, much darker.
The castle. Holmes arrived in Chicago around 1886. He was charming, confident, and always had a plan. He found work at a pharmacy in the Inglewood neighborhood, on the south side of the city. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Holton, was happy to have such an educated and helpful young assistant. Her husband was ill, and Holmes was a doctor after all. He could help. Mrs. Holton and her husband disappeared not long after Holmes arrived. Holmes told people they had sold him the pharmacy and moved away. Nobody investigated too carefully. He was so polite, so helpful, so trustworthy. He now had a business, and he had plans for something much bigger. Using money from a series of fraudulent business schemes, always borrowing, always promising to pay back, never actually doing so, Holmes began to build on a large empty lot he had acquired across the street from the pharmacy. The building that went up on that lot was 3 stories tall. It took up most of a city block. Locals began to call it the Castle. What made the castle strange was the way it was built. Holmes hired one construction team, then fired them and hired another, then another, then another. No single group of workers ever saw the whole building. No architect ever had complete plans. Holmes himself directed much of the construction, changing his mind constantly, ordering walls to be built and then torn down, requiring strange features that the workers found puzzling. There were rooms with no windows and no obvious purpose. There were doors that opened onto brick walls. There were hidden passages connecting different parts of the building. There was a shaft built into the walls, like an oversized dumbwaiter, that could lower heavy objects between floors. In the basement, there was a large furnace, and next to it, a strange table of metal, stained dark in ways that were difficult to explain. None of the individual workers understood what they were building. That was exactly what Holmes wanted. On the upper floors, he created a hotel. He rented out rooms to visitors, advertising the castle as a respectable place to stay for the duration of the World's Fair. Young women looking for affordable accommodation were especially welcome. He also installed a gas system throughout the hotel. It was connected to the pipes in a very particular way. From a control panel in his own bedroom, Holmes could turn the gas on or off in any room in the building. He could fill a room with gas while someone slept inside it without ever leaving his bed. The fair began. The World's Columbian Exposition opened on May 1st, 1893. It was even more magnificent than anyone had imagined. More than 27 million people attended over the 6 months it was open, an almost unbelievable number for that era. The fair celebrated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus arriving in America, and it was designed to show the world that America was now a modern, powerful, and creative nation. The main exhibition area, called the White City because of its white painted buildings, glowed with electric lights every night. There were inventions that seemed like magic: a dishwashing machine, alternating current electricity demonstrated by Nikola Tesla, the first Ferris wheel standing 80 meters tall. There was food from around the world, there was music, there was art, and there were people, arriving by the thousands every single day. Holmes watched from his castle with great satisfaction. Many of these visitors, especially the young women who had come to work at the fair or find new opportunities in the great city, needed a place to stay. His hotel was charming, the price was reasonable, the owner was handsome and kind. Some of them never checked out. Holmes had a method. He would choose a victim carefully. Usually, it was a woman who was alone, without strong family connections in Chicago, without people who would immediately notice if she disappeared. He would make her feel special. He had tremendous charm. He was educated, funny, and attentive. He made women feel as though they were the most important person in the room. Then, once he had their trust, and often their money, transferred through one of his many business schemes, he would act. The victims. Julia Smythe was one of the first to disappear. She was married to a man named Ned Connor, who worked for Holmes in his jewelry department. Julia began an affair with Holmes. She became pregnant. In December 1891, before the fair had even opened, she vanished. Her daughter, Pearl, who was about 8 years old, vanished at the same time. Holmes told Ned that Julia had left him and taken the child. Ned was devastated, but what could he do? He believed Holmes. Emmeline Cigrand was a beautiful young woman who came to work as Holmes' secretary in 1892. She came from Indiana, full of optimism about her future. She told friends she had found a wonderful job working for a wonderful man in Chicago. Within months, she had disappeared. Holmes told people she had left to get married. Her family never heard from her again. The Williams sisters, Minnie and Nanny, were from Texas. Minnie was intelligent and owned property, which immediately made her interesting to Holmes. He proposed marriage to Minnie, never mentioning his other wives, and she accepted with joy. Holmes used her legal ownership of property in Texas to commit fraud. Then Minnie disappeared. Her sister Nanny, who had come to Chicago to visit, disappeared soon after. Holmes told acquaintances they had gone to Europe. These are the names we know. There were others. Young women disappeared from Holmes's hotel like smoke in the wind. Each time he had a smooth explanation. Each time people believed him. He was a doctor, after all, an educated man, a gentleman. In the culture of that time, such a man was simply not suspected of such things. The bodies went into the basement, the furnace burned, and Holmes continued to smile and charm and plan his next move. The insurance scheme. The World's Fair ended in October 1893. Business at the hotel stopped, and Holmes, who had enormous debts from the building of the castle and from various failed fraud schemes, needed money urgently. He had a plan. He always had a plan. Holmes left Chicago and began to travel. He went to Texas, to Missouri, to Philadelphia. Everywhere he went, he ran new fraud schemes, borrowed money he never repaid, and left chaos in his wake. But his most ambitious plan involved a man named Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was one of Holmes's oldest criminal associates. He had helped Holmes with various frauds over the years. He was not a particularly bright man, but he was loyal to Holmes, or thought he was. Holmes had convinced him that they were partners, friends even. The plan was this. Holmes would take out a large life insurance policy on Pitezel, worth $10,000, which is roughly $350,000 in today's money. Then they would fake Pitezel's death. They would use a different body, a corpse obtained through criminal connections, and claim the insurance money. Then they would split it. That was what Holmes told Pitezel. That was the plan Pitezel believed in. The real plan was different. Holmes never intended to share anything. In September 1894, in Philadelphia, Pitezel was found dead in a rented room. He had been poisoned with chloroform. It was not a fake death. It was a real one. Holmes had killed his partner, and then calmly filed the insurance claim with Pitezel's own wife as a witness to identify the body. But now Holmes had a problem. Pitezel's wife, Carrie, had 3 of her children traveling with Holmes: Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitezel. Holmes had told Carrie he was taking the children on a trip to visit their living father, as part of keeping up the fiction of the fake death. Carrie did not know her husband was really dead. She was simply a grieving widow being manipulated by a man she trusted. The 3 Pitezel children were alone with Holmes, and Holmes, with cold and terrifying logic, decided they could not be allowed to live. They had seen too much. They could identify him. They were, to his mind, simply a problem to be solved. Alice was 15 years old. Nellie was 11. Howard was 8.
The net closed. Holmes had been making mistakes, not large ones, not the kind a careless criminal makes. But the world was beginning to catch up with him because the world had a detective named Frank Geyer. Geyer worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been hired to investigate the suspicious circumstances around Pitezel's death. He was a methodical, patient man. He did not jump to conclusions. He followed evidence carefully, step by step, like a man picking his way across a dark room. Holmes had been arrested in November 1894, but only for fraud. He was sitting in prison in Philadelphia, charged with horse theft and insurance fraud, when Geyer began his investigation in earnest in 1895. Carrie Pitezel had been located. She told investigators about her husband's death and about Holmes taking her 3 children. She had not seen the children since the previous year. She was becoming desperate with worry. Geyer began to trace Holmes's movements through late 1894. He followed the trail city by city: Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto. He carried photographs of the 3 children. He went from hotel to hotel, boarding house to boarding house, showing the photographs and asking questions. Had anyone seen these children? Had a man matching Holmes's description stayed here? It was slow, painful work, week after week with no definitive answer. But Geyer was building a picture, and the picture was becoming very dark. In Toronto, in July 1895, Geyer found the house where Holmes had rented rooms. The landlord remembered Holmes. He remembered 2 little girls, and he remembered something else. Holmes had asked to borrow a spade, saying he wanted to dig a hole in the cellar to bury some rubbish. Geyer and the local police dug up the cellar of that house on St. Vincent Street in Toronto. Several feet below the surface, they found the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. They had been buried together. They had been gassed. The world had barely absorbed this horror when weeks later, investigators found Howard Pitezel's remains in a house in Indianapolis. He had been burned in a stove. 3 children, murdered, while their mother, a grieving widow, had been traveling nearby, sometimes on the same train as Holmes, never knowing her children were dead, kept just out of reach by the man who had already killed their father. The newspapers erupted, the public was stunned, and investigators began to look more carefully at Holmes's past and at the castle he had left behind in Chicago. The horror revealed. Chicago police entered the castle in July 1895. They had received information from various sources: former employees, disgruntled creditors, people who had noticed strange things about the building over the years. They did not know what they would find. What they found changed them permanently. The building was a labyrinth. There were over 100 rooms, and many of them made no obvious sense. There were rooms that could only be entered from outside, from the adjacent building, with no interior door. There was a room sealed with a heavy metal door, with a gas pipe running into it, and scratch marks on the inside of the door. Someone, or more than one person, had been locked in that room and had tried to get out. There were chutes running from the upper floors directly to the basement. These were not for luggage or laundry. They were the right size for a human body. In the basement, investigators found the metal examination table, now deeply stained. They found a large kiln, a type of very hot oven capable of destroying bone. They found glass bottles containing chemicals used to dissolve flesh. They found a rack of surgeon's instruments carefully cleaned. And in the earth of the basement floor, they found human bones, fragments of ribs, part of a skull, chips of bone that had been subjected to intense heat. They also found something that would eventually become one of the most significant discoveries.
Holmes had sold the stripped skeletons of his victims to medical schools, presenting them as legitimate anatomical specimens obtained through proper channels. This was not as shocking as it sounds. A gray market for human skeletons existed in medicine at that time, and medical schools did not always ask hard questions. But it meant that even in death, Holmes had found a way to profit from his victims. As investigators searched further, they found evidence suggesting that Holmes had processed at least a dozen bodies in the castle, and possibly many more. The exact number was impossible to determine because the remains had been so thoroughly destroyed. Holmes had been methodical about that, too. The newspapers called it a murder castle. They printed diagrams of the building, labeling each sinister room. Readers across America and across the world read with a mixture of fascination and horror that such a place could exist in a modern city, in a country that prided itself on progress and civilization. Trial and confession. Holmes was already in prison when the castle's secrets were discovered. He was brought to trial in Philadelphia in October 1895, charged specifically with the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had taken out the insurance policy. He had identified the body. He had the insurance money. And investigators could prove that Pitezel had been deliberately poisoned. Holmes chose to defend himself at his trial, which surprised everyone. He was charming in court, as always. He spoke clearly and calmly, with the confidence of an educated man. He denied everything. He constructed elaborate alternative explanations for each piece of evidence. The jury did not believe him. They deliberated for less than 3 hours. Holmes was found guilty of murder. While awaiting execution, Holmes did something astonishing. He wrote and sold a detailed confession to a newspaper. In it, he claimed to have killed 27 people, though he gave this number in a theatrical way that suggested he enjoyed the attention. He described several of the murders in detail. He also, in characteristic fashion, lied throughout the confession, mixing truth with fiction in ways that were impossible to fully unravel. Investigators believed the true number of his victims was higher, possibly much higher. Some estimates have reached 200, though serious historians believe the real figure was more likely between 20 and 50. The difficulty was that Holmes had been so careful, so methodical, and many of his victims were people without strong social connections, women who had come to Chicago alone, who did not have families waiting anxiously for news. They were easy to disappear, and Holmes knew that. He also retracted parts of his confession later and then reconfirmed them, and then changed his story again. He played games with the truth until the very end. Was this because he wanted attention? Because he was trying to create doubt? Or simply because lying was so natural to him that he could not stop, even when it no longer served any useful purpose? Perhaps all three. The end of Holmes. On May 7, 1896, Henry Howard Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. He was 34 years old. His behavior on his last day was characteristically controlled. He ate a large breakfast. He was calm. He spoke with his lawyer. He did not show obvious signs of fear or regret. Witnesses at the execution noted that he seemed almost at peace, or at least that he showed no emotion that a normal person would associate with the approach of death. He had made one unusual request before his execution. He asked to be buried in cement with extra layers of concrete over his coffin so that his body could not be exhumed and studied. For a man who had sold human skeletons to science, this was a strange final demand. Perhaps he feared what researchers might find. Perhaps it was simply one last attempt at control, at determining what happened to his own body, just as he had determined what happened to so many others. The request was granted. He was buried in a grave filled with concrete at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania.
The murder castle burned down in August 1895. The cause of the fire was never conclusively determined. Some suspected arson by people trying to destroy evidence. Others thought it was an accident. What remained of the building was eventually demolished. A post office now stands on that corner of South Wallace Avenue in Chicago. In 2017, a group of researchers and a television network were granted permission to exhume Holmes's remains, amidst persistent rumors that Holmes had faked his own death, a rumor fueled partly by the fact that he had always been an expert at deception and partly by claims made by some of his descendants. DNA analysis of the bones confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Herman Mudgett. The man in the concrete grave was, in fact, Holmes. He had not, for once, found a way to escape. What he left behind. The story of H. Holmes raises questions that are still being asked today, not just about him, but about the world that allowed him to operate for so long. How did he get away with it? Part of the answer is simply his skill as a manipulator. He understood with rare clarity what people wanted to believe. He told them exactly what they needed to hear. He was charming, educated, and confident, characteristics that, in his time and ours, make people reluctant to ask hard questions. When something does not seem right about a person, but they speak and dress and act like a gentleman, how many of us look more closely? Not enough of us. That was true in 1893. It is still true now. But there is another part of the answer that is more uncomfortable. His victims were largely young women traveling alone, women who were, in the language of the time, without connections, without powerful men in their lives to demand answers when they disappeared. The system of the 1890s simply did not value these women's lives enough to investigate their disappearances with the seriousness they deserved. They vanished, and the world moved on. Holmes understood this. He chose his victims partly because he knew the world would not look for them too hard. That is not a statement only about H. Holmes. It is a statement about the society he lived in. Holmes is often called America's first serial killer, a label that is dramatic and memorable, but not entirely accurate. There were almost certainly other serial killers in American history before him. What makes Holmes unique is the scale of his operation and the cold architectural nature of his crimes. He did not kill in moments of rage or passion. He built a machine for killing, planned it over years, and operated it with the calm efficiency of a businessman running a factory. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about him. He was not wild or chaotic. He was organized, patient, and rational. He treated human beings as resources to be extracted and disposed of. And for years, the world around him provided everything he needed: a booming, anonymous city, a culture that trusted educated men without question, and victims whose disappearances would not raise alarms. The World's Fair that ran alongside his crimes was meant to show humanity's greatest achievements, its art, its science, its capacity for wonder. In the shadow of those gleaming white buildings, Holmes demonstrated something else: the capacity of an intelligent human mind to turn entirely toward destruction and to use the tools of civilization, medicine, architecture, business, charm, in service of nothing but cruelty. His victims deserve to be remembered not as parts of his story, but as people with their own stories. Julia Smythe, who made the terrible mistake of trusting the wrong man. Emmeline Sigrand, full of hope for her future in the great city. The Williams sisters, who came to Chicago looking for family. Alice, Nellie, and Howard Peitzel, 3 children who had done nothing wrong except exist in the path of a man who saw them as inconveniences. Their names matter. Their lives mattered. In the end, that is the most important thing the story of H. Holmes leaves us with, not a fascination with the killer himself, but a reminder that behind every crime statistic, every case file,
every sensational newspaper headline, there are real people who loved and were loved, who had plans and dreams, who deserved to live. The devil of Chicago is gone. His castle is gone. But the questions his story asks about trust, about power, about whose lives we value and protect, have never stopped being relevant. They never will.
Another dark chapter closed, but the mystery of human nature continues. Thanks for listening to True Crime Stories for English Learners. Don't forget to subscribe and join me next time for another real story that's stranger than fiction.